Catholic Apologetics Today, Part 9. After identifying the units out of which a passage is composed, the critics of the history of the tradition can be determined, noting that it ever happened at which of these three stages. This is very good, but our essential question is, what does this show us of the reliability of various things in the Gospels? At this point, we meet with quite a difference of opinion among critics. Some are almost totally skeptical, saying we cannot be sure of much of anything. Others are more open-minded. Among the more severe positions is the use of the so-called principle of dual irreducibility. This means that a saving of Jesus can be considered authentic only if it meets two tests. One, it does not fit with the Jewish thinking of the time. Two, it does not fit with the viewpoints of the later church. This view is founded on extreme skepticism about the honesty of the evangelists and others in the early church. So they call this community creative. A special example of this creativity is supposed to appear in the controversy dialogues. Bultmann wrote about this in his History of the Synoptic Tradition, page 40. The controversy dialogues, as we have them, are creations of the church. In other words, imagine two groups within the church disputing. Group A has no saying of Jesus to support what they believe, so they just invent one. Group B has none either, so they too invent a saying, no respect for the truth whatsoever. This, of course, is ridiculous. Can we really imagine people who know that their eternity depended on getting the facts about Jesus just making up things? We know that could use different major genres of the sort we saw in Chapter 8. But we can, with the principles we saw in that chapter, determine what they meant to assert was factual. Bultmann himself admits his ideas on controversy dialogues are subjective. So he adds, naturally enough, our judgment will not be made in terms of objective criteria, but will depend on taste and discrimination. Subjectivity shows again in the fact that Bultmann thinks the controversy dialogues arose in the apologetic and polemic of the Palestinian Church. It is quite inappropriate to call these passage paradigms, for examples of preaching as Dibelius does. For Dibelius said the community life situation has been preaching for missionary purposes. Two great pioneers cannot agree on so simple and basic a point. As we said, the critics like to claim that the early community was creative and that it ran with no check at all by the apostles or by the truth. The 1964 instruction warned against this error. Finally, there are others who make light of the authority of the apostles as witnesses of Christ and their function and influence in the primitive community, but it magnifies the creativity of the community. All these things are not only opposed to Catholic doctrine, but lack a scientific foundation and are foreign to the true principles of the historical method. Acts chapter 5, verses 12 through 13. Tells us about the real position and control exercised by the apostles. And by the hands of the apostles were many signs and wonders done among the people. And they were all one accord in Solomon's porch. But of the rest, no one of the rest dared to join himself to them, but the people magnified them. Acts chapter 2, verse 42 says, and they were persevering in the doctrine of the apostles, and in the communication of the breaking of the bread, and in prayers. The critics see much creativity in miracle stories. They commonly try to compare them to pagan or rabbinic miracles, saying that they have the same pattern and then give little value to the accounts. A large part of the reason is that, in varying degrees, critics reject in advance the possibility of anything supernatural. But we showed in Chapter 3 of this book that miracles checked thoroughly by modern science still occur today. As for the alleged similarities to pagan or rabbinic miracles, even if they did exist, they would not disprove anything. Actually, there is scant similarity, as detailed studies have shown. Summary of these studies and references to the original studies can be found in William Most, The Consciousness of Christ, page 218 to 219. Besides, as we have often said, the fact that their eternity depends on getting at least the basic facts right about Jesus would assure that the community led by the apostles who had seen for themselves would get the basic facts right. A. Did the evangelists change the sense? At first, the critics thought the evangelists should not be called authors at all. They were compared to stringers of beads because they supposedly just put together, in hardly any set order, what bits about Jesus they had gathered. Now the pendulum, predictably, has swung the other direction, and the evangelists are called high artists, showing magnificent skill. We do not deny some skill in the artistry of the evangelists. We admit that each had his own purpose or theological framework to stress, but this would not lead them to falsifying anything at all, nor could one evangelist contradict another, for we are all instruments of the Holy Spirit, the chief author of Scripture. However, now we must deal with the claim that by putting together in different orders or settings, the evangelist could change the sense of things. To get at the truth, we need to distinguish two kinds of materials, namely simple, straightforward things, in contrast to things that are by nature enigmatic or of flexible meaning, such as proverbs and similar sayings. About the simple things, the 6 basic points we have concluded surely cannot be affected by what setting they are put in. There was man Jesus, who claimed to be a messenger from God, and proved it by miracles worked in special connections. He had an inner circle within his followers, told them to continue his teaching, and promised that God would protect it. Clearly, a change of settings for these items will not affect their meaning, hence what they need to prove the teaching authority of the church is intact. Really, most sayings of Jesus would mean precisely the same old matter, what setting they were put in. Really, most sayings of Jesus would mean precisely the same no matter what setting they were put in. But there are some biblical sayings that could shift in setting. Form criticism does a good service in pointing out that Mark, chapter 13, verse 30, probably was the first written with a setting referencing to the fall of Jerusalem. Most of Mark 13 seems that way. This generation shall not pass until all these things be done. But in the present setting, after Mark chapter 13, verse 27, which seems to refer to the return of Jesus at the end, Mark chapter 13, verse 30 could be puzzling. Though we could still take a generation to refer to the Christian era, which is to last to the end and would make all of Mark chapter 13 a multiple fulfillment pattern. Imagine the meaning of these two verses changes when we know the setting. Matthew chapter 10, verse 27 says, "That which I tell you in the dark, speak in the light. That which you hear in the ear, preach upon the housetops." Luke chapter 12, verses 2 to 3 says, For there is nothing covered that shall not be revealed, nor hidden that shall not be known. For whatsoever things you have spoken in darkness shall be published in the light, and that which you have spoken in the ear in the chambers shall be preached on the housetops. Now, if we check the contexts, Matthew refers to public preaching by the apostles later of what Jesus told them in private. But in Luke, the sayings seems to refer to the hypocrisy of the Pharisees eventually brought to light. So it seems that this change of setting changed the sense of the passage. What change shall we say about this? First of all, Jesus was a traveling speaker. Anyone familiar with public speaking knows that speakers will often repeat things in different places, using slightly different language, or even with some shifts of ideas. Jesus easily could have said the same thing in two different settings. Further, we happen to know from the Targum on Quoleth 12:13 that this saying really was a proverb. The meaning of proverbs is flexible. Even beyond that, it would not be unfaithful for an evangelist to make different applications of some non-essential sayings, particularly proverbs and enigmatic sayings, which are flexible by nature. We know, too, that St. Paul could change the setting of quotations he made from the Old Testament. Yet he always did it in such a way that the thought was really faithful to the teachings of Christ. We conclude that there can be such variations in applications, and on proverbs and perhaps a few other sayings too, but they are not an instance of infidelity to the teachings of Jesus, and for certain they simply cannot touch the basic truths that we enumerate, which are part of the foundation of faith. We say this for two reasons. First, the intense concern for facts stemming from concern for their own eternity on the part of the writers. Second, the basic truths are, as we said, such that their meaning is simply by nature incapable of shifting when placed in a different setting. B. Retrojection. In chapter 16, we spoke briefly about retrojection, taking a scene that had really happened after the resurrection and placing it before that. We saw in chapter 16 that some types of retrojection would involve falsification, such as retrojecting a prophecy. A prophecy has no meaning if it does not refer to the future, but other kinds of retrojection should not be falsification, as long as the things really happened and the words were really said in substance, at least. However, we also said that it does not seem likely that the Synoptic Gospels would do this because it does not seem to fit with their unfanciful and factual genre or pattern. Form critics are quite inclined to claim retrojection, that is to say that certain things presented by the Gospels as though happening in the East really took place after Easter. Various reasons are given for such claims, especially the belief that the Gospels are not factual reports, the belief that Matthew and Mark clash in their picture of how much the disciples understood, and the belief that Jesus was ignorant. Let us examine each of these points separately. Fitzmyer forcefully expresses the first of these notions. The Biblical Commission calmly and frankly admitted that what is contained in the Gospels is not a record of the words and deeds of Jesus at the first stage of the tradition. We recall from above that there were three stages. First, the words and actions of Jesus, who adapted his presentation to the audience. Second, the way the apostles and other preachings, these, adapting also the presentation to the audiences. And third, the recording of parts of his ongoing preaching by the evangelists under inspiration. Of course, the Biblical Commission did not admit that there are 3 stages, and did admit that it is obvious that the apostles, like any good teachers or speakers, would adapt their presentation. However, we need to stress a statement in the 1964 instruction of the Biblical Commission that the critics are apt to leave out. The fact that the evangelist reported the words and deeds of the Lord in different sequences, that they express his statements in varied ways, not word for word, but yet keeping the sense. These things do not at all affect the truth of the narrative. We can admit a difference in presentation and even in wording of the sayings of Jesus. However, the 1964 instruction insists that the revised wording and presentation still faithfully reports what was really said and done. The concern of the evangelists and the apostles and of the Christians in general for their eternity would ensure that they wanted facts. The 1964 instruction added something to which the critics like to point. After Jesus rose from the dead and his divinity was clearly seen, the faith of the disciples not only did not wipe out the memory of these things that happened, but rather strengthened that memory. There is no reason to deny, however, that the apostles handed down to their hearers what the Lord had really said and done, in light of the fuller understanding which they gained by being instructed by the glorious events of Christ and being taught by the light of the Spirit of truth. We notice first that the instruction insists on the fact that the disciples, when they saw his divinity clearly, not only did not want to distort the memory of what the Lord had really said and done. So there is an insistence on the truth of the Gospels. Yet, to say that they wrote in the light of better understanding could leave room for some retrojection. We must explore precisely in what areas the claim could consist. A special case is clearly the second reason for supposing the retrojection which we mentioned above, namely the fact that Mark consistently pictures the disciples as slow to understand, while Matthew, chiefly in Matthew chapter 14, verse 33, and chapter 16, verse 16, has Peter and even others calling Jesus Son of the living God. How can we explain this seemingly difference? One way is surely to say Matthew is retrojecting, yet it is far from certain that he did so. First, the phrase Son of God could be applied to any devout Jew. However, in context, it surely means something more in Matthew chapter 14:33 and chapter 16, verse 16. How much more? Commentators are much divided, so even though we grant that the evangelist did write in the light of fuller understanding, we would not have to say 14 verse 33 and 16 verse 16 involve clear and full knowledge of the divinity of Jesus. Some commentators do say that Peter fully understood his divinity. Others say Peter did not. They say Peter had only a slight grasp of the fact that Jesus was Son in some special, perhaps even unique sense. J.D. Kingsbury put it this way: the title Son of God in Matthew's Gospel refers to the deepest ministry of the person of Jesus. That is, in him, God draws near with his eschatological rule to dwell with humankind. This, of course, is not the same as saying clearly that Christ was the natural Son of God. If one says Peter did not know the divinity of Jesus, We must still explain the fact that Jesus praises Peter in chapter 16, verse 16, as having a revelation from the Father, and the fact that Peter later can still deny Jesus. In C below, we will take up these problems. Critics also like to claim ignorance in Jesus. Almost all scholars today insist on this, in spite of the clear teaching of the Church. My book, The Consciousness of Christ, quotes all these documents and answers every argument for ignorance advanced by scholar of note. Of course, they claim the ignorance of Jesus, and they then can say that Jesus did not understand enough to directly found the church, and so they have an added reason for saying the promise of primacy was really given after Easter. C. Retrojection of Peter's confession. Quite understandably, Protestants like to try and do away with the grant of real primacy to Peter. Thus, J.D. Kingsbury, in the article cited above, argues that some length to try to show that Peter was merely presented as the typical disciple and spokesman for the others, but yet is not given any more power than the others. In chapter 16, we saw that regardless of all debates about Matthew chapter 16, verse 16, we know from the teaching of the church protected by the promises of the messenger sent from God, Jesus, and that there is real papal primacy. These critics will, of course, favor rejection. Many Catholic scholars also contend retrojection of Matthew chapter 16, verse 16, such as Joseph Fitzmyer. So let us evaluate separately the two possibilities about Peter's understanding. The first possibility is that Peter did not know the divinity of Jesus before Easter. If so, we might have retrojection of 2 points. The confession of divinity, if Peter's words mean that, and promise of primacy. Even then, these 2 points could remain true in themselves, and we have seen in chapter 16 that John 21 does report that the actual grant after Easter. One reason against retrojection would be the strongly factual character of the synoptics, plus the fact that Mark and Luke paint the apostles as dull. How Matthew represents them is in clear sense, as we said, the sense of the words, Son of the living God, is difficult to fix. Still further, would a special revelation to Peter have been needed after Easter? It is not so likely. B. The second possibility is that Peter did know. This seems the more likely option. But there is a problem. If Peter did know, how could he have been so slow later in accepting the resurrection, and even before that deny Jesus? Mystical theology provides the answer. When one gets an interior revelation, a locution, it will seem fully certain at the time it is given, but later, saints have become uncertain about the revelation. God permits this to try them. St. Teresa of Avila, a doctor of the Church, who knew about these things from personal experience, reports in her interior castle, when time has passed since it was heard, and the workings and the certainty it, the soul, had that it was God have passed, doubts can come, thinking if it was the devil, if it was imagination. None of these things was there in the present. It, the soul, would have died for the truth of the locution. So Peter could have had a revelation and have believed in it firmly, and so have confessed the divinity of Jesus. Yet, as St. Teresa says, the certainty could fade. This is especially likely in Peter, who had a strong belief that the Messiah would be a great conqueror. When Peter saw Jesus failing and being condemned to death, we see how Peter could have given up his previous belief and even denied Jesus. As we said in chapter 16, the lack of these added words in Mark and Luke could be explained by noting that neither Mark nor Luke were present. Especially, Mark depended, as we saw in chapter 10, on Peter. Peter's modesty could have led him not to preach the additions. D. An ignorant Jesus? Many attempts at interpretation by form critics have resulted in ideas that are gravely erroneous. A major example is the way Reginald H. Fuller, one of the most prominent form critics, treats Mark chapter 8, verses 29 to 33. Jesus and the apostles are in Caesarea Philippi, a pagan territory. Jesus asks what people are saying about him, and they tell him various things. Then, according to Fuller, there are 4 units. Jesus asks the apostles who they say he is. Peter answers, "You are the Messiah." 2. Jesus tells them not to tell that he is Messiah. 3. Jesus then predicts his passion. Peter objects. 4. Jesus turns on Peter saying, "Get behind me, Satan." The critics see no problem with units 1 and 4, but they think the church faked units 2 and 3. They say the second unit resulted from the fact that Jesus did not know he was Messiah. Later, the church was embarrassed that he never said he was the Messiah. So, to cover up the church, faked conversations in which he would admit it, but command silence. The critics call this the messianic secret. First, the fidelity of the evangelists and apostles and their concerns for their own eternity would not permit such a faking. Further, the support of the critics offer for their claims of fakery is no good. They appeal to cases where Jesus works miracles and commands silence. Their strongest case is Mark chapter 5, verse 43, in which Jesus raises the daughter of Jairus. W. Reed, a major critic, commented that there is no sense in a command to silence in this instance because anyone could see the girl was alive. But the critics have missed an important element. How long did the fact need to be hidden? In this case, just long enough for Jesus to slip out, for the miracle was done in the house with only a few present, and get on his way. He did not want the crowds to know because they might have seized him and proclaimed him King Messiah, in their false notion of a Messiah as a mighty conqueror. So if those in the house would have been quiet for a short while, Jesus would be on his way. Would not the crowds remember? People are surprisingly fickle. Proof is Palm Sunday with its hosannas, followed less than a week later with "Crucify him." Or remember Paul and Barnabas in Lystra, Acts chapter 14, verses 8 through 19. They had cured a cripple, and the crowd went wild, wanting to offer sacrifice to them as gods. Yet a few minutes later some Jews arrived from the last place Paul had preached and inflamed the crowd so that they stoned Paul and left him for dead. Still further, the critics think Mark was an excellent artist. A fine artist knows that if he produces fiction, and that it is what the critics think it is, the fiction must be plausible. If he cannot make it plausible, he will just omit an episode. So, if Mark had thought of faking an implausible incident in the story of the daughter of Jairus, he would have had the sense to drop the idea if it had not really happened. The case is similar to other incidents in which the critics cite as proof of the messianic secret. We turn to the third unit, in which Jesus predicts his passion, and Peter objects. Here, the critics say that the passion prophecies were also faked by the church. They say if he had really foretold his death and resurrection, the apostles would not have been so surprised when it happened. Here again, the fact that the evangelists and the church are so concerned with their own eternity would exclude the possibility of fakery. But, in addition, there is no need to be surprised at the behavior of the apostles, for more educated men, even today, show quite a similar lack of perception, as we had explained at length in chapter 15. So we return to Fuller's form-critical analysis of Mark chapter 8, verses 29 to 33. He had said that 2 of the 4 units had been faked by the church. We have examined his reasons and found them without merit. But he and countless others with him have not understood and have concluded that units 2 and 3 are fakes, and the truth is found in units 1 and 4. They believe that Jesus did not know he was Messiah and resented the very idea. Thus, when Peter says, "You are the Messiah," Jesus angrily turns on him and retorts, "Get behind me, Satan." Very interesting, the same R.H. Fuller now has second thoughts about form criticism and the whole historical critical method in general. Fuller now thinks that this historical critical method is bankrupt. He says that bankruptcy should be overcome by feedback received from the believing community. So should we just ask people what they think or feel instead of finding out what Scripture says? Many other scholars, too, are giving up on their historical critical methods today. That is regrettable, for the method itself is not basically bad and has good potential if used properly. It is another case of the pendulum reaction in which the scholars went too far and abused form criticism, not realizing that seldom does it really prove anything, since the evidence it works with is almost totally internal or subjective. So they reached conclusions on unsolid premises, ignoring more solid proofs and thinking the conclusion solid, presumed to build still more on top of them with equally unsolid footing. No wonder they now give up. If only they would see it as it really is and make proper use of the method. E. Warnings in the 1964 instruction. Many today quote the instruction telling us that we may use form criticism, but oddly they quote only parts of it and do not add the stern warning the instructions contain. He, the scholar, should act circumspectly because philosophical and theological principles that cannot at all be approved are often found mixed with this method. Principles which are not rarely vitiate both the method and the conclusions on literary matters. For certain practitioners of this method, led astray by prejudiced opinionisms of rationalism, often refuse to admit the existence of the supernatural order and the intervention of a personal God in the world by revelation, properly so called, and the possibility and actual existence of miracles and prophecies. Even some Catholics have failed in these respects, saying the Old Testament prophecies of Christ were hindsight and in denying many miracles. They have forgotten that Vatican I insisted Moses and the prophets, and especially Christ, the Lord, put forth many most manifest miracles and prophecies. They also forgot the Targums, which we studied earlier. Had the critics heeded the sound advice of that instruction, they would not now be in despair over the historical critical method, nor would they have reason to say this method proves the Church is wrong on things. Recall the sad error of Norman Perrin on form criticism of Mark chapter 9, verse 1, which we saw earlier. F. Did Vatican II undermine teaching authority? Father Avery Dulles, Society of Jesus, in his presidential address to the Catholic Theological Society of America in 1976 said, indirectly, the Council worked powerfully to undermine the authoritarian theory and to legitimate dissent in the Church. Vatican II quietly reversed earlier positions on a number of important issues. He gives several examples. First, he says that in biblical studies, the Council approved of a critical approach to the New Testament, in line with the Divino Afflante Spiritu of Pius XII, and thereby delivered the Church from the incubus of the earlier decrees of the Biblical Commission. Second, he says the decree on ecumenism reversed earlier attitudes to the ecumenical movement. Next, the Declaration on Religious Freedom accepted the religiously neutral state, and so reversed earlier teaching. Further, he claims that the Constitution on the Church in the modern world adopted an evolutionary view of history, and that this ended more than a century of eminent denunciations of modern civilization. Therefore, he says, the Council admitted that the ordinary magisterium of the Roman pontiff had fallen into error. So, he asserts the popes had unjustly treated and damaged the careers of loyal theologians. Father Dulles did refer to the statement of Vatican II on the teaching authority of even non-infallible statements, but dismissed it lightly. We examined that text in studying the 3 levels of teaching in section 2 of this appendix. First, in a way, Dulles charges a reversal by Pius XII on scripture and study techniques. My books, Free from All Error, answers this claim in detail and shows that the early decrees of the Biblical Commission are not really an incubus, mythological male devil who attempts to force intercourse on human women. The Council favored the ecumenical movement but gave great cautions about it. It warned against a tendency, often seen in ecumenists, to strain interpretations of doctrine. It said it is altogether necessary that the full doctrine be lucidly explained. Nothing is so foreign to ecumenism as that false peacemaking in which the purity of Catholic doctrine suffers detriment and its genuine and uncertain sense is obscured. Did the Declaration on Religious Freedom accept the neutral state, and so reverse the previous view that the state should formally profess the truth of Catholicism? Dulles has missed something. In the first section of the Declaration, the Council said, it leaves untouched the traditional Catholic doctrine about the moral duty of men and societies towards the true religion and one only Church of Christ. The Council did add in Section 2 that people have a right not to be threatened with prison, death, etc. if they are wrong. But it did not say they have a right to be wrong. The reason is clear. A right is a claim to have or to do something. Basic rights come from God. As the U.S. Declaration of Independence says, all men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Does God really give someone a claim or a right to be wrong? Hardly. It is enough to give the claim or right not to be penalized by the state for being wrong. The church has never denied that, though some today, especially followers of Archbishop Lefebvre, claim it did deny it. We shall see about that claim again. In Appendix 1.10. If men have a right to be coerced, does the church lose the right to teach with authority? Not at all. If men have a right not to be coerced, does the church lose the right to teach with authority? Not at all. It is one thing to teach with the authority of Christ, that is true, and another thing to threaten to force it if one does not believe. As we saw earlier in 2 of this appendix, the same council also strongly asserted the rights of the church to teach and our obligation in conscience to believe. Did the Constitution on the Church in the modern world adopt an evolutionary view of history and modified optimism regarding secular systems of fault, of thought? Father Dulles gives no reference to any part of the Constitution that would say such things. He just refers us to an article in Theological Studies by L.J. O'Donovan for support. O'Donovan makes clear that what Dulles had in mind is a supposed influence of the ideas of Desjardins on the council. The strongest opinion favoring a Chardin at the council came from Bishop Spulbeck of Meissen, Germany, who thought Chapter 3 of that Constitution showed much of his influence. Does it? First of all, there is no mention of the evolution of the human body in that chapter, or of evolution of doctrine. It does speak of progress in material civilization, but it also warns, sacred scripture teaches, that the great advantages of the human progress bring with them grave temptation. The hierarchy of values is disturbed, good and evil intermingle, dour combat with the powers of darkness pervades all human history, hence the church. Trusting in the design of the Creator and admitting that progress can contribute to the true happiness of man, cannot help making heard that the saying of the apostles, "Be not conformed to this world," Romans 12. Man can and should love the things God has created, in giving thanks to the benefactor for them, using and enjoying them in poverty and freedom of spirit. He has brought into the true possession of the world, as if nothing, and possessing all things. We find neither a trace of Desjardins in this, or any contradiction of past teaching, nor do we know of vehement denunciations of modern civilization come from the church, just warnings against abusing creatures, which is the same thing we find in the quote we just read from Vatican II. So, Father Dulles failed to prove that the council had said that the Pope had fallen into error and had unjustly harmed the careers of loyal and able theologians. Yes, there have been restrictive actions by Rome, but with good reason. We will see a fine case of that later in treating evolution. G. Did Vatican revolutionize all theology? If such a claim were true, we could suspect that the Church had been wrong before. or is wrong now. How do we check such a claim?